and welcome to yet another episode of Africa Talks. And today we'll be talking about the representation or depiction of Africa in global cinema. Is it real? Is it imaginary? Or is it just a stereotypical depiction of Africa and Africans as we see in cinema the world over? And to talk more about that, I have four eminent panelists with me from different parts of the world. And I would like to welcome them to this show. First of all, I would like to welcome Mr. Azubuike Arinuga. Mr. Azubuike, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Narender.
Mr. Azubuike is a well-known filmmaker who has done remarkable work in Nollywood and is now into film entrepreneurship also. And we'll get to know more about his work and his thoughts about today's issue later in the show. I would also like to welcome Ms. Anandana Kapoor, who is founder director of Cinemad India, and she's a filmmaker, and she has been picking up several challenging issues, especially related to gender, culture, and other very strong social issues in her work. So Anandana, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to some fun conversation.
Great. Our third panelist today is Mr. Richard Yao Boitang. He's joining us from Ghana. Mr. Richard is a filmmaker, actor, writer, and he has been in the forefront of promoting the film industry in Ghana. So, Mr. Richard, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, I appreciate it.
Great. Our fourth panelist today is Mr. Iziogo Namdi. Mr. Namdi is a Pan-African and he's founder of Exilient Africa. So, Mr. Namdi, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Great. Unfortunately, due to some technical issue, we don't have Mr. Kelechi Eke with us currently. Probably he'll join. He's trying to join us, and once he is available, we'll welcome him again in the show. So let's go ahead with today's discussion. Friends, India is synonymous with cinema. We are mad for cinema. India is a country which produces thousands of films every year. Bollywood, everybody knows, everybody recognizes. And apart from Bollywood, there is a very strong regional cinema in the country. There are very strong alternative and parallel cinema in the country. But as far as Africa is concerned, we rarely get to see Africa in Indian cinema. We hardly get to see an African actor or an African landscape or an African narrative in our films. So largely our source of information about Africa in terms of visual media or films is restricted to international cinema, mainly English cinema. And the kind of Africa that we see in English cinema and Hollywood, to me, it appears is very stereotypical in its treatment. Over the years, we have seen same kind of narratives, same kind of anecdotes, same kind of exotic tribal dances, exotic rituals happening in Africa. Same kind of visual has been created around Africa and African traditions. So Africa has changed a lot in last 20, 30, 40 years. But we don't get to see that real side of Africa so much in the Western cinema. Mr. Azubuike, do you agree with me that the stereotypical image of Africa that was created by the colonial storytellers is still persisting? Whether it's Hollywood or any other Western filmmaker or film industry, they are still projecting Africa the way it used to be projected 30, 40, 50 years back. Mr. Azubuike.
Yes, I totally agree with you. And I say this based on the facts. Generally, it's not just about the movies, but there's this establishment that has been on, all over the years, who the black man is or who the black woman is. And this establishment has made it definitive, okay, that if you raise somebody to play this specific role, it has to be a black person, it has to be an African. So when you watch a movie, and, there are some kind of characters that is expected. These characters, they really have to play through this stereotype for it to be acceptable. Okay, and then playing along these specified stereotypes, then you are not seen as actually making a realistic movie. Take, for instance, even in films that have an African background, look at a film like Hotel Rwanda. Okay, it's Hotel Rwanda and it's supposed to be made inside Rwanda, but you find out that most of the scenes in the movie are all made in South Africa. Okay, so it's not just about the characters, it's also about the setting, it's also about the location. There are a lot of film, how do I say it, like, the techniques that also have to be specified to move along an established argument. You know, in a movie, if somebody has to be positive as a character, it doesn't really have to be the African, but if there's a negative, then it's the African guy or the African lady that has to play that role. Okay, that is one. Then another part of stereotype is someone who is not even African or doesn't have a background in Africa is actually the one producing an African film. So there's already a problem ab initio before the production. All right?
Yes.
So the person who is writing this film is only writing from a preconceived notion. The outlook is already, okay, this guy will be this guy will be this, because you don't know about these guys, and then you're creating scenarios and you're creating characteristics and you're creating dialogues, you're creating everything about something you don't even understand. But remember, it's all about the establishment. And because it is this establishment, every department in the filmmaking would also want to go along the line of this established. Okay, so you cannot come and say, no, this guy is a doctor. Oh, he's an African, he cannot be a doctor. Okay, somebody has to carry the waste dustbin outside. Okay, yes, it's the African role. I have seen a movie, sorry, I'm taking too much time. I've seen a television series where someone has to be an Igbo man. I'm an Igbo man from Nigeria. Someone has to be an Igbo man. And the dialogue is written in Igbo. And then we have an American, African American, played that role. And I don't know what it will take to get an Igbo guy to play that same role. It is very easy to just make an announcement and you see like 300 Igbo guys and you choose one. But why would they want an African American to speak Igbo with African American accent? And we, being Igbo people and African, we look at it as degrading. You know, there's no dignity. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to us. But to them, they prefer it instead of getting an Igbo guy to play that role and say the Igbo dialogue the right way. So that is the point. I don't know what we are going to do about it, but basically, I think there are reasons why all these things are happening. Let me just...
Okay. Coming to you, Richard, what you have to say about this conventional portrayal of Africa and Africans in the global cinema, especially in the English cinema?
Yeah, like I was again, I agree with my brother. Let's take the movie Idi Amin. The movie Idi Amin was shot by American production studio in Ghana. It's supposed to be an Uganda movie because Idi Amin is from Uganda, and they brought Freeman Whitaker from America to come and stay in Uganda to learn Uganda language, to learn accents, for about 4 months before they start shooting. Why couldn't they have picked an African who has the accent as a mother tongue to make it work? But they have to bring somebody from outside the jurisdiction to come and portray the continent, which is like, is it that the African cannot represent himself in his own narrative unless you bring a black American to come and portray an African? So the stereotype has been for long, and I think it all has to do with the fact that we don't have our own cinemas. Our governments have not been interested in the cultural economy. Various African countries, the government don't have interest in the cultural economy. So they don't invest into building their cinema film industry. So
the government is, so Mr. Richard, I think you have raised a very important point. I'll interrupt here that the government is not supporting the development of the local film industry. I'll come to that point again, Mr. Richard, and we'll talk about that again later in the show. I would now like to go to Ananda now. Ananda, do you think this is some kind of a celluloid misrepresentation, or it has been deliberately done because that's what sells in the market? You know, as Yuvike said, you know, if you have to show a negative character in a story, and you show an African, a black guy in there. So why this kind of celluloid misrepresentation is still continuing? What could be the factors according to you, especially when we see it in Hollywood and other English cinema?
You know, I think it's very interesting listening to this conversation because it acknowledges the fact that there is more production investment in working with cinema in Africa, but there is very little investment in trying to break the dualism that we have, which is the exotic other. In fact, you know, as a filmmaker and as a member of the audience, I would be interested in an internal dualism, which is how is, you know, modernity and say women's rights being negotiated? How are gender rights being negotiated? What is, you know, the conversation around archives? Because we have this idea of Africa, which has been completely colonized and cannibalized, right? Our idea of what the continent looked like depended entirely on archives that were created by the Western other. And most of the times these were colonial masters. So the question is that how can we go back and even challenge those notions that we have received from visual history? So this, I think, battle is not just about the now, the battle is also of the before. And we can't say, you know, what's past is past. Because, you know, how were those images narrativized? And there's some interesting work which is being done in Congo, work being done in South Africa. And I was just, you know, reading a few days ago that there is something known as the Afro Hair Open Source Project. So there is this professor, her name is A.M. Dark, and she's trying to create African hairstyles as options for people who are developing animated characters. And she's saying that, you know, the way they have been represented so far have only been caricatures. So there is a certain kind of talk back also which is happening. And that only comes when I think the modes of production are taken. And we say that, all right, I'll use your means, but I'll show you my story. And within the Indian context as well, I think if you look at mainstream media, we're guilty of the same binary. Either this is a black person with a heart of gold, or it is a black person with an evil self. So there is no control, there is no moderation. And that's because we've let our prejudices continue unquestioned. What is also changing for makers, I think, is this myth that this is what the public wants. I mean, I've grown up listening to this all the time. This is what people want to see. No, they don't. The question is, unless you give them variety, they'll not be able to tell you what was more comfortable for them. And the African woman also, I mean, right now we're a panelist of, you know, members from Africa who are male filmmakers, but what about women filmmakers? How many of them are able to represent issues such as femicide? How many of them are able to say that, you know, I want to make a film which makes me question my own tradition? And there are so many beautiful concepts which are possible. So like I said, I think it needed Western hegemony to be able to show, you know, the African identity also as a mixture, like this identity. I understand Africa is more close-knit, but it's not just about being an African, right? You could be from a particular space. You could be a Tunisian, you could be an Egyptian, and you would have very specific ideas to present. You could be Algerian, you could be so many other kinds of identities. And I would like that variety so that I can enjoy the expression. And, and like he said, an Igbo man speaking in a particular way, you can audition and get so many people who are from the soil. So it's also a question of, I think, investing in training, in allowing films that don't look perfect. So it was Espinosa, the Cuban filmmaker, who said that let it be poor cinema. Let our images not be high definition. Let us, not necessarily have the most good-looking images, but let it be images of, for, and by the people. And I think that is the spirit we have to achieve. We should relook at what our standards of aesthetics, a successful film, and a successful story are, because we have such rich oral traditions. I'm talking about the South Asian context and the African context. Our ideas of storytelling and time are so different. Our cinema can be even more different. So for that, we need to say, I will not listen to, or I will not follow your aesthetic standard. I'll do it my way. So
Yes.
That's
great. I think that's a wonderful point made by Anandana. Coming to you, Mr. Namdi, the kind of Africa we see in especially in Hollywood, be it James Bond movies or it's Blood Diamond, or these $1 billion Hollywood movies, is that the real Africa? If not, then where is the real Africa? Please unmute yourself, Mr. Namdi.
Yeah. Firstly, I'd like to say Happy International Day to all, of course, and Father's Day to the fathers and those of us who are hoping to be fathers very soon. It's a popular saying in Africa that because the lion does not tell its own story, the hunter always emerges heroic in the stories. So I think the issue that Africa has always have is firstly standard. Secondly would be narrative. And when I mean narrative also, it's we have to understand that people go into movie production and acting for various reasons. Most of the time because of socioeconomic issues, they go in for the profit. So they don't even care to go through the script. They don't even care to come up with something that actually presents a visual that they would, they'll be proud of, that projects their identity in a way that is more of who they really are. So I think the Africa that people see on the media, so the thing is, Africa is all glorious, but you see what we see on the media is a disastrous pornographic image of Africa. You have human rights violation. You have issues that are not actually pertaining to Africa as a continent. And this is something that is also has to do with technology. It has to do with knowledge transfer, because originally, though we started drama and plays, we were not the ones who invented the technologies to make it more visual. So I think just like most of the panelists have mentioned, Africa needs to awaken her consciousness. There needs to be a reorientation. All stakeholders, people need to see movie production. People need to see this as an important aspect of not just the economy or generating of funds, but repositioning themselves globally. So I think what we've seen all over the world, even in Indian movies about Africa, is not Africa. That's firstly. And just like you see the fair and lovely stuff in India, and you see those who are the Kalas and all those who act the South Indian movies, and how they've been derogated into a specific category of a kind of a movie and all that. This is something that has to change, and that is why everyone has to wake up against stereotype and discrimination, because movie industry also plays a huge role in spreading this. So I think we have a collective role to play, and until we're ready to start, from the African perspective also, we need to create a standard of what it is to be African. We don't need to subject ourselves to pre-colonial, post-colonial and all. There's a modern Afrofuturistic ideology that's there already, and people are already doing it. Like you see the Wakanda movie, you see on Netflix now, the kind of movies you see about Africa are movies that actually projects Africa. So we expect that there's a proper democratization of the media space globally, even in India particularly. We have a lot of people who want to feature in movies. So these are the things that we need to look into for the glorious future, collective future that we're hoping for.
Okay, so I think a very important point which Mr. Eziogu mentioned is repositioning yourself. When we talk about repositioning, let me take an example from India. The way India has been showcased in Western cinema is still very stereotypical. We still have India, that is India which has bullock carts, which has snake charmers, which has Maharajas. For a very long time in Hollywood films, India was only shown as the land of Maharajas, the land of snake charmers. But what has happened in last 2 decades and 3 decades is that Indian film industry, and it's not just about Bollywood, even the regional film industries have been able to carve a niche for themselves in the international market. So you have a market for Tamil film, Gujarati film, Bengali film, and Hindi films outside India also. And they have been able to project a different image of India as compared to what was being projected through Western cinema. So, something similar on these lines have not happened in Africa. Africa itself has not been able to position itself, as a real Africa. How you bring the real Africa in the narrative, how you visually showcase the real Africa, as Eziogu, you were pointing out, the new age Africa. So why that repositioning of African cinema, African culture, African traditions, the changes that have taken place in Africa in the last few years, why it has not been part of the visual media and why it has not been repositioned internationally? So where it lacks. Richard, coming to you, if you would like to take up this question first.
Yeah. Africa, like I was saying, over here, where most of the countries were under colony. And the colonial masters instituted a kind of cinema business, which was not meant to promote the African heritage, but to subdue the African and make the whites superior over the African. That system was what was left for us. Unfortunately, like how I said before, the African government that took over did not see the power of the audiovisual, the power of the cinema, that the cinema have a weapon to reorient the mindset of our people for our own independence, economic independence, social independence. We did not see the cinema as the weapon as it is, as the whites were seeing it. We were seeing cinema as an entertainment, full stop. So there was no interest in putting so much into developing our cinema. That's why the stereotype has remained for all this while, because we only get the Western society doing movies for Africa and depicting Africa, and they have the largest distribution network. There's no African country today who has a wide distribution network into the Western cinema. Even Nigeria being the second largest producer of movies, Nigerian movies doesn't appear in the Western cinema. They don't show our movies in the cinemas, box office. We don't have box office record of a Nigerian movie. We don't have box office record of our movies in the Western cinemas. We are recorded, Nigeria is recorded as the second largest producer of movies. But economically, Nigeria is not part of the list. Because when we say box office revenue, our movies don't go to their box office. They don't allow it. They don't recognize our movies as box office worthy. So we are, for us to come out of this whole argument, the first thing we need to do is to build our own box offices. Even look at Nigeria. Nigeria, upon all that he has, with about 200 something or 200 population, Nigeria have only about less than 20 cinemas. Less than 20 cinemas with about 70 screens. So how can we even reach out, even in Nigeria?
Yes.
Nigeria is almost up to United States of America. America is about 300 million plus. Nigeria is 200 million. So look at the population connectivity. But America has 41,000 screens. And Nigeria has about 69 screens, not even up to 100 screens. So
yes.
you see, our cinema, we have the power. We need to invest into cinema development, which
Yes,
will build.
I think Mr. Richard, I think you have got a very good point that we need to invest in cinema development. I think that's a very important issue. Coming to you, Mr. Ezubuike, why we don't see African cinema on international platforms? Why we don't see African cinema in countries like India or in other countries in Asia or in Europe? Why African film industry in different countries or the African government or the African embassies are not putting effort to popularize their cinema in different countries? Mr. Azubuike.
Can you repeat the question? The audio is kind of muffled up here. I can't hear you very well.
Okay, I was saying that, you know, why there has been no push from individual African countries in making their cinema popular in the international market. Why your government or your embassies in specific countries are not, you know, inviting films in foreign countries to showcase the real Africa to the people?
Okay, let me see what I can do. I didn't hear the question, but let me see if I can answer from you're asking. First of all, I don't want to sound political, but an issue with government in Africa generally, we all know that. So it will be kind of unserious on our own part to expecting government to this and do that, because I don't want to go political, like I said, but.
Oh, my brother, you have to go political because we are talking about African freedom. You have to go political.
Let me.
Mr. Richard, let Mr. Azubuike speak. Yeah.
So, I mean, when you look at a group of people, they come into government somehow, they manage to win elections and they come in government, right? Their priorities will be to settle people who help them to come into government. Okay? Their priority will be, how do I make money cover the expenses I make to get into this government? So there's no time to build infrastructure, including building cinema or including film. It's none of their business. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that it's right, but I'm just trying to be realistic. Right. So
that's not government's priority.
I don't know what happened after this. When I was in Delhi, I spoke to a producer who told me that they have maybe close to 2,000 screens in New Delhi alone. But in the whole of Nigeria, I don't think we have up to 100 screens. See, this is where the problem is. We can't continue blaming the West. The West have built on film industry, and they built the industry purposely to promote their own culture and prove that they are superior to the rest of the world. And they also, in process of doing that, acquire money and make profit from their business. There's no way they will come leave their own interest and start focusing on the interests of Africa. It is incumbent on us, the Africans, to also say, we can also build our cinemas. Everything is not for the government to do. There
Okay,
are
got your point.
sectors.
Got your point, Mr. Azubuike. Coming to you.
The last point, we pay so much money, for example, to buy expensive cars. One person will buy a car of $5,000. What are you doing with that car? Where you can invest, not just in cinema, but there are areas of investment. So most of the time, we don't have to blame the West or blame the government. We also have to blame ourselves.
Yes, I think that's a very good point and a very realistic point made by Azubuike. Coming to you, Iziogu, youth have been couriers of their own culture to different parts of the world. In India, every year we have so many young Africans coming for higher studies. Why don't you try to promote your own culture or cinema here, maybe informally in colleges through African film shows or African film discussions or African musical shows? Cinema, I think in India, lots of colleges have their own, student groups for promoting cinema, and they organize informal screenings within the colleges. Why not take this informal route also to promote information about African cinema wherever you go? Not just India, but maybe other countries also.
Well, I think
very briefly. Sorry for interrupting, but we need your very brief point here. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I've basically personally I've done that, and if you can look also the fabric which I'm putting on is an African fabric. I think you can also recount how many times you've seen me put on suits. Not that I'm being discriminatory, but because I feel culture has to be promoted. When the Woodpecker Film Festival was there the last time, we were there also in our numbers. The little we could mobilize to also show our support and solidarity to that film festival. And while I was there with my colleagues as a student representative, the Association of African Students, we've played huge role in connecting with the international film city here you have in Noida. We even have fashion shows where we get a lot of students to play, to play as models. But the fact still remains when we talk about support and policies. Okay, for example, here also that the African students cannot venture into businesses. They cannot have startups. So it makes no sense that someone comes to India and study media and journalism, but cannot have an opportunity to even have a practice for even if it's internships. So this whole thing has to boils down to the government, and also has a lot to do with first the individual decolonizing their mindset. Okay, because a lot of people feel so relaxed that they are just studying. They even see their culture as something they should run away from. They see it as something that is so ancient, and this is not their fault. It's taken a long time to project this mindset into the people. So this is what we are changing. We are changing it by taking the first step ourselves. I'm not just alone in this movement. We have a lot of, it's a cultural revolution that
I think that's a very good step you've taken, and I'm sure in the coming months or coming years we'll have full-fledged African film festivals happening in India.
Exactly.
That people can actually get to know what real Africa is. Coming to you, Anandana, both Richard and Mr. Azubuike talked about the limitations that the industry is facing there in their specific countries. Do you think the challenges of distribution, the challenges of getting finances to promote African cinema abroad, to some extent that can be overcome in this age of digitalization of cinema, where you have Netflix and other streaming channels who are doing it live from various parts of the world? So do you think it can provide a good opportunity for lesser known cinema, particularly from African countries, to get a more diverse market and audience?
Right. So, I mean, when they were speaking, I was thinking of the OTT circuit. And
Yeah.
it's true that I have seen some interesting films like my colleague at Cinemad told me to see Material, which is set in South Africa. Keteke was a film which sort of, created a lot of waves. I remember meeting with this very dynamic female producer, Laureen Addy from Ghana. And she was sort of traveling with her film Aloe Vera in the Berlinale. And so, there is a lot of interesting work which is being done, and there is possibility to fit it into curatorial spaces online. But I will be circumspect in saying that this is the panacea for all evils, because there are circuits there too. What is the kind of Africa that the OTT circuit wants to present? Will an average African filmmaker be able to access these distribution platforms? Because there is a hierarchy in production as well. In India too, there are certain kinds of films and filmmakers who have larger platforms, and it's not always a question of talents, it's a question of your network. So if you're really looking at a transnational network, what are the skills with which you can sort of break into that circuit? So I think alongside conversations about screening spaces, in an era where you have personal screening devices, it also becomes interesting to train filmmakers to sort of pitch, to present, to articulate, to network. And I think that's a hugely burdensome task for a creative professional, because you are so caught up with making your film that all of these trappings of how to take it, where to take it can be very exhausting. And I know that so many of us are unable to start our next project because we're just so busy trying to take it to the audiences that we imagine it should have. So I think it's not easy, but there's a lot of potential. And again, sort of, introducing a little bit of extended reality into the conversation. He was talking about the fact that there is a new sensibility also, which is emerging from African youth. And there is this new, theoretical paradigm. It's called the neurospeculative Afro-feminist methodology, NSAF. It is being used by Hyphen Labs, and they have a virtual reality piece where they look at an Afro sort of feminist salon where women go and get their hair braided, and they sort of talk about how these cultural practices possibly could have neuro aspects to it. And so it's beyond culture, it's what it does to your body, what it does to your mind. And these kind of explorations, I think, are happening in the digital space, which may have been a little difficult to do with traditional filmmaking apparatus. So I think there's a lot of interesting work being done also in these niches. So I'm very hopeful. But again, like I said, as somebody who's outside, it's easy to say that I like to watch your films,
Yes.
and I'm enjoying them on OTT, but how do you get it there? That remains.
But there is a huge potential to be explored, and maybe
Certainly.
maybe some of the filmmakers in Africa who have that kind of network, I think they can take the lead and take the first step for others also. That brings me to the last part of this discussion. Mr. Richard, coming to you, you have been working tremendously to promote cinema in Ghana and the Ghana cinema, internationally also. If I ask you any one, story or one narrative which you would like to showcase through your cinema and which you would like to showcase from Ghana to the entire world, what it would be? What you really want to showcase from Ghana to the world through your cinema?
Yeah, we have a lot of heritage stories that have not been touched, have not been documented on the screen. The initiation of African independence, which instead started from Ghana. Kwame Nkrumah's story has not been screened, has not been documented into cinema. Our queens, our chiefs who fought the British to maintain our land for us, they have not been, their story has not been told, has not been documented. We have stories, indigenous stories in West Africa, in Nigeria. They are heroes who stood in and fought the British before finally they were conquered. All these narratives have not been told. And the white man will not tell the narrative because it knows that it will give the African that self-awareness and self-confidence to fight back. So they have not made those stories, and they can't make it. Thank God, nobody has made those stories for us. And they are the stories we need money, we need funding, because they are certain. The setting is like way back 18th centuries, 19th centuries, then 20th century. So you need to have a setting to really tell the story by indicating the truth of the era. So this one comes with set building, like Baugari or Maubari. This Indian story, it looks like native. It is fiction, but when you look at it, it looks like a native, epic story. So most of our stories, our narratives, historic narratives, goes with some epic features, which demands some funding. And this is the thing that we want to showcase to the world. If we got the funding, in Ghana like this, we filmmakers have advised ourselves never to make any attempt to do any of our narratives, our historic stories, until we have the funding that can make it happen. So these are the things we have that we want to tell the world.
Wonderful. Coming to you, Azubuike, you have worked a lot in the Nollywood film industry. What do you think? Are there any issues in Nigeria which you would still like to work upon in the coming years, or which you think have remained unexplored as far as Nigeria is concerned?
Is that me?
Yes.
Still repeat. The audio is terrible.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I'm asking, you have worked a lot in the Nollywood film industry. Yeah. Can you hear me, Azubuike?
Honestly.
Okay, I'll text you. I'll text you my question. You see it in the chat box.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Please, yes.
And I'll just text you in a few seconds. Coming to you, Anandana.
Okay.
You have worked a lot on several important social challenges through the kind of cinema which you make. And I'm sure through various mediums, you have good amount of knowledge and information about Africa as a continent and the kind of issues that are there. So any specific issue or issues that you would like to focus upon if you get a chance to work on a fiction or non-fiction film on Africa?
That's a very difficult question. I grew up reading so much of like Gugi wa Thiong'o and Nadine Gordimer, and today, Adichie is such an influence. So, I mean, the root of a lot of fantastic thought, poetry, and experimenting lies in the African tradition. But I think my heart sort of rests with looking at humor and trying to see if we can have, a greater conversation about change through humor. I would definitely be interested in looking at issues of femicide, which I think concern women globally. And I think we talk a lot about cinema, which shows a lot of African masculinities. We need to sort of also look at, how women and other members in the gender spectrum are represented. So, I would be interested in grandmother stories, really, if I had to whittle it down to one theme and their take on today, because I think they have the benefit of time and they also have the benefit of being a little open. So, those would be the stories that I would seek and I would use them to talk about today. And humor would be necessary.
Great. Iziogu, being a youth who believes in Pan-Africanism, what kind of cinema you would like to see from Africa? Like, what kind of issues you as a youngster wants the cinema from Africa to talk about in today's time? Very briefly, if you can share that.
Well, I think if we would want to focus on the current challenges that Africa is facing and want to use that as a benchmark to the kind of movies which we produce, that could be very limiting. just like Ananda has mentioned with regards humor, using humor to make a lot of imprint in the movie industries there in Africa. I think human capacity development with the help of technology that is there right now, we have a lot of access to technology, smartphones. So everyone can play a collective role on how they represent the continent, entire continent of Africa. The reason why I do not identify with an African country, I think I've spoken this on many forums, is because I think there is still the highest level of colonialism that still exists, imperialism that still exists. And I, for one, I do not want to be a slave to anyone. I think it's a free world. Human rights is something that we've all been gifted with naturally from God as we've been created. So I think we all have that right to represent ourselves. If we want to clog ourselves in terms of geopolitical or demographics, that's fine. If we want to relate it to culture and tradition, that's fine. If we want to look at tribes, countries, it's something that the people have to decide themselves. So I think this is something that is important that Africa to project. Africa is not old. It's a very young continent. When everyone is developed, we are there, we're waiting, because once everywhere is developed, it's our turn. So we still are very comfortable with the underdeveloped nations, which we are being termed as our continent, because we know that in the future, which is very nigh, it's going to be our turn. And one thing which is important, Mr. Narendra, to note is the fact that the Indian movie now Z-World has a huge place in Africa and can serve as a tool to further project the India-Africa relationship that is forged on the basis of mutuality and respect. You know, so I think this is something that we need to focus on. We need stronger partners who understands what we want to actualize for the country.
No, you're right in saying that cinema could be a very strong bridge between countries and nations, and I'm quite interested in organizing, maybe in partnership with all of you, an African film festival, which could be a regular feature here in India, and where we try to showcase what actually Africa is to people here, to audience here in India. Coming to you, Mr. Azubuike, if you have seen the question, coming to you for the last point. Mr. Azubuike, were you able to see my question?
Yeah, I think you're saying any issue I would like to make a movie on in the near future.
Yes.
Yes. Is for me, you know, it's very important for me to know who I am. Okay, I'm from Nigeria. I'm from the ethnic group called Igbo. But then there's been a lot of discrepancies and not concluded historical narrative of where the Igbos originate from. I understand in the central there are some other ethnic groups outside Nigeria that have Igbo as their language. So I think this is my interest in the next couple of years. By grace, I mean, everybody is very easy. But if I have life and I have the opportunity, I would like to go and the origin of the book properly document and have it a case closed. It will become reference for everyone. Say, these people are from here. It took 20 years to this point. They settled here because coming from some place and so on and so forth.
Yes. Great. So, so that brings us to the end of this discussion. After talking to all of you, you know, I can very confidently say that in the coming years, we'll get to see a lot of African cinema, maybe on different platforms. It could be on digital platforms or on the big screens here in Delhi or in other Asian countries. I'm sure filmmakers like Azubuike and Richard and youngsters like Iziogu will definitely be the trendsetters in their own countries to take this mission forward. And young filmmakers like Anandana would definitely be interested in providing support to any kind of transnational, partnership or endeavor to promote African cinema here in India. I think one point which I want to make right now is that the indifference to stereotype has to end. There has to be a reaction. For a very long time, whether it's Bollywood or it's Hollywood, largely the filmmakers and the audience has remained indifferent to kind of the kind of stereotypical projection that has been given to Africa. That needs to go away. So we need a different kind of perspective to see and to project and promote African cinema. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining today in the show. Mr. Azubuike, thank you for connecting with us today from Nigeria. It was wonderful meeting you after so many years. So thank you so much. Mr. Richard, thank you for joining us from Ghana.
Yeah.
Anandana.
One point. Yeah. You mentioned that we should get the African Film Festival. Let it happen. I'm waiting for it.
Definitely. We'll reach out to you about it very soon. Ananda, thank you so much for joining this show. It was wonderful having you today. And we look forward to have you again in the coming shows. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Iziogu, great having you again. And I think the youngsters can definitely make a lot of difference, and especially when they identify themselves as ambassadors of their own cultures. So thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, viewers, for watching this show. We'll be back again next Sunday on another issue about India and Africa, and with a group of wonderful panelists. So good night and goodbye. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.